Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. This is the fifth edition of our webinar series, India in Asia. The series tries to unpack India's changing position as a rising power in Asia. In particular, it asks what kind of roles can India play as a rising power, and how do countries of the region particularly view India and its rise. In our previous editions, we have discussed India's relationship with Maldives, with Philippines, with Japan, with ASEAN. And today we are going to discuss India's relationship with Malaysia. And it is an understudied, but I think a very important topic. Uh, the modern bilateral relationship between the two countries stretches back to colonial era. British Empire essentially tied the two countries together through trade flows and investment flows, through a lot of strategic arrangements, and most importantly, diaspora. At the time of Indian independence, 1 in 5 Indians living abroad was living in Malaysia. So Malaya has been always a very important part of Indian approach to Asia. And India has maintained diplomatic presence in Malaya, colonial Malaya, since 1923, when British India sent its first permanent representative to the Crown Colony. And it is the oldest diplomatic relationship that India has with any Southeast Asian country. In fact, an Indian judge, his name was Hakim Malik, he was part of the commission that drew up the first constitution of Malaysia at the time of its independence. And even in fact, even during Cold War, which is considered a time when India drifted away from Southeast Asia, it is not realized, but actually Malaysia was one of the most favored destinations for Indian investment and joint ventures abroad. And in the 21st century, this bilateral relationship has been more diplomatically productive than many other Southeast Asian relationship of India. Not only have the two countries a comprehensive strategic partnership, but Malaysia is one of the only two countries in Southeast Asia to have a SICA with India. And although there was a rocky phase in late 2010s over Kashmir issue, the relationship has recovered smoothly in recent years. And the Prime Minister Modi's visit to Malaysia in this month really reaffirmed the partnership. And it was a great serendipity for us because we had actually planned this event before that trip happened, but it nicely coincided. I think India-Malaysia ties, and this is just a brief framing that I'll make here, which is that India-Malaysia ties are important to understand not just in their own right, but also to understand India's relationship with larger Southeast Asia, I think, on essentially two fronts. One is, I think it is worth asking why India-Malaysian relationship has been relatively more productive when compared to many other bilateral relationships between India and other Southeast Asian countries. What is the magic ingredient there? And the second question is that despite the relatively smooth sailing over last 30, 40 years at least, there seems to be a ceiling to what the relationship has achieved so far. And that is another question, I think, which is worth pondering over a little bit in terms of what perhaps this ceiling in some way or the limits to this kind of reveal the larger limits that India's Act East policy and its approach to Southeast Asia can have, or what it can achieve in the region generally. So to unpack this very interesting relationship, we have with us Thomas Daniel, someone I've been looking forward to have on this series for a while now. Thomas is the director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies program at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. His work focuses on Malaysian foreign policy and the strategic security challenges of Southeast Asia, including the impacts of major power dynamics on the ASEAN. He's member of the Malaysia Study Group on Myanmar, convened by University Malaya. He studied international studies at University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and communication, media, and culture at University of South Australia. In fact, I should stop giving more of his introduction because if you are interested in Malaysian foreign policy, you will likely come across his work at one place or another. So it is really my pleasure to welcome him. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. A very good afternoon and very good evening to those of you who are joining. It is a pleasure to speak on this subject. It's also a daunting one. As Sandeep mentioned, the Malaysia-India bilateral is a historical one. It is an important one, and at times it is a complex one. But I think this is no different to many of Malaysia's most important and enduring bilateral ties. Our bilateral ties with China, the United States, with Europe are extremely important, but they're also extremely complex, and there are sometimes different and common complexities at play. Uh, Most of you would be aware that next year, both countries mark 70 years of bilateral relations. Uh, and Malaysia also celebrates 70 years of independence. And it's important to note, as Sandeep had earlier, the influence that a then relatively newly independent India had on a much more newly independent Malaya. Prior to independence, the Indian independence movement was one of several that were an inspiration for assorted Malayan independence movements, both before and after the war and beyond just ethnic Indian migrants in then Malaya. Sandeep, you mentioned that the Malayan Constitution was developed, had a link to India. You're completely right. The Reid Commission had an Indian member, and I think even other members of the commission largely drew on the Indian Constitution in the creation of the Malayan Constitution, and as was the importance of Indian legal thought and jurisprudence practices, the foundational elements of the Malaysian criminal and contract laws. All of these drew on existing laws and practices and thoughts that were developed in India. And of course, broader cultural relations go back 2,000 years, but I prefer to focus more on the contemporary. Um, Before I proceed any further, I must clarify, I give you a caveat here that I don't specifically work on India. I certainly don't claim to be an expert on India and its diplomatic and strategic thinking and its history and its drivers. However, what I will try to do is I will address the issue and the topic of the promise and reality of the Malaysia-India relationship from a Malaysian view, from the thinking of what I think foreign policy drivers and considerations are here. And of course, my views are all personal and nothing is to be attributed to my institution. So before I dive in, there are three broad points that I intend to do. The first is a quick overview of the outcome of PM Modi's visit, which I think is extremely significant. Secondly, I will talk about the impacts of domestic politics, of geopolitics and security. And by way of conclusion, I will touch a little bit on ensuring progress on the CSP that we have and the sort of pragmatic measures that I think are quite important as well. So, first up, the visit of Prime Minister Modi earlier this month. And, he was last here in 2018, I believe. This is quite some time ago, because the visit was extremely substantial in terms of substance, it was substantial in terms of optics, and both of this actually matter. Depending how one reads it, I think we saw up to 11 iterations of MOUs or agreements and up to 16 deliverables in total, which were announced during the visit. I might be wrong on the number. I stand to be corrected on that. But these outcomes range, from collaboration on disaster management, anti-corruption, semiconductors, which has become an important conversation between both countries, education and culture, to security, defense cooperation, and much more. Uh, Let me perhaps just highlight a couple of things that stood out to me overall. Um, I think the focus by both governments on pushing ahead with digital financial cooperation measures is one that stands out to me. It's an area that Malaysia is actively seeking partnerships from, whether it's including from China, including from the West, and I think this is an area that India leads extensively. It is one of the world's most comprehensive digital public infrastructure and fintech ecosystems. A lot of it was developed indigenously. So India is a natural partner for Malaysia, and there's a lot of interest by Malaysian institutions and organizations on this. It's an area that India has a competitive advantage in, and it looks like there's a push to take advantage of this. Um, on the defense side, after a long hiatus, I think now we see some finalizations in terms of reference for the Strategic Affairs Working Group. And one of the outcomes is the Sukhoi 30 Forum, which is a very real deliverable. And it's a very important deliverable for Malaysia based on prior discussions from 23 onwards. Malaysia has very little choice but to rely on the Sukhois as an Air Force workhorse. And besides Russia, I think India is the only other major country and operator that can afford to do complex MROs and upgrades for these planes. Russia is not an option for us right now, probably unlikely to be for a while. And these planes are in dire need of maintenance and upgrades. It's also not the first time that India plays a role in Malaysia's Sukhoi 30, in Malaysia's in the planes that we have, the Sukhoi 30s that we have. In the early days, when we purchased this aircraft in 2008, I believe, the Indian Air Force was instrumental to the RMAF's early operationalization of the plane. They helped with both training and in drafting the air combat doctrine for the aircraft. IAF officers were placed in RMAF for a couple of years to do this. So you see an element of continuity here. One more thing that stood out to me is the establishment of India's first consulate in Malaysia beyond Kuala Lumpur, in Sabah in particular, in East Malaysia. It's a region that is really far-flung from KL, but it's a region that is politically and strategically important. And I think it's a very bold and forward-thinking initiative from New Delhi to establish its first consulate outside KL, first diplomatic presence outside KL in Sabah. So as I said earlier, the optics also matters, and a couple of things here stood out, right? So Prime Minister Anwar welcomed Prime Minister Modi at the airport. Something that I think actually happens for very few leaders. If I'm not mistaken, this was only done for Trump, Xi, and Erdogan. These are the ones that I recall. It was also Modi's first foreign visit of the year, and a reciprocal one to Malaysia after PM Anwar visited Delhi in 2024, where relations were upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership. This is the highest tier in Malaysia's diplomatic nomenclature. I'll probably refer to it a few times later in my remarks. It is also important, I think, optically, because Prime Minister Modi did not attend the 47th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur last year, which turned out to be one of the largest gatherings of global leaders in the Asia-Pacific last year. My second broad point, Sandeep, is on domestic imperatives and politics when it comes to the bilateral relations. In a report that my colleagues in ISIS Malaysia did, it was published in December 24, a few months after Prime Minister Anwar's visit to Delhi, when the relationship was upgraded to a CSP. I'll refer to this again in my conclusion. My colleagues argued that the political drivers of the bilateral relationship are not merely shaped by high-level visits or institutional mechanisms or multilateral mechanisms, but also by semantics and perception. And it is my concern that semantics and perception, especially semantics and perceptions of communalism, of majoritarianism, of identity politics in both countries are impacting the scope of bilateral relationship. And they also, very predictably and unfortunately, feed off each other. It empowers those who would rather see the relationship limited and complicates things for governments and policymakers. In Malaysia, the Malaysian polity, especially the Malay Muslim majority, have been growing more religious. They have been becoming more Islamist, more nationalist, and more supportive of what it perceives to be persecutions faced by Muslims abroad. This is an important voting bloc that is contested by the large parties in Malaysia, who will inevitably cater to these shifting sentiments to win votes in the short term. At the same time, from where I sit, contemporary Indian nationalism has acquired a very Hindu nationalist framing under the BJP. So, reports of pressures faced by Muslims in India gain growing salience in Malaysia. And in both Malaysia and India, I think, these issues get a lot of traction on social media. Sometimes they get traction in mainstream media. And there's a lot of reporting on perceived criticisms that India faces abroad on this issue, that Malaysia might face from Indian groups on these issues, and they do feed off each other. When PM Modi visited here earlier this month, there were actually groups that were out to inflict political damage on the Prime Minister and his coalition. They worked to criticize the visit because of reasons I mentioned above. There were attempts to deliberately play up long-standing complex dynamics of local Hindu temples, many of them small, community-based and built on land that are owned by others. So these are very real dynamics within the Malaysian system that the government must keep in mind when it comes to managing the bilateral relationship. Now I don't think these challenges are a glass ceiling, uh, but they do mean that the dynamics need to be very carefully managed, that progress will be measured because you have public opinions in both countries that are highly responsive to perceived slights and threats and issues from abroad. But I'm preempting my conclusion, so I'll move on to my next one, which is the impact of geopolitics and security dynamics. Now, this is not to say that Malaysia-India ties are driven or dependent on external factors of third countries. In fact, it's quite opposite. Sandeep, you mentioned in introduction, ties are historical, and both parties really have their own interests and own reasons to work to elevate bilateral ties, and that largely drives it. That said, however, I think bilateral ties do not happen in a vacuum. You see the Malaysia-India relationship also playing out through regional mechanisms like ASEAN and in its related mechanisms like the East Asia Summit. You see the Malaysia-India bilateral relationship playing out through APEC and most recently through BRICS and BRICS Plus. Perhaps previously, the non-aligned movement and the Commonwealth carried more weight for both. I don't think so anymore. So India's support, or at the very least, India's lack of objection for Malaysia to continue to play an active role in BRICS Plus and to push for eventual full membership matters to Malaysia. It's in Malaysia's interest. We saw Prime Minister Anwar mentioning this at least twice during Prime Minister Modi's visit here. And a new element of the multilateral dimension is conservation, with Malaysia joining the International Big Cat Alliance. Excuse me 1 second. So at the global level, you know, we see a landscape that is shaped by competition, by coercion, contestation for influence, trade disputes, tech restrictions, military tensions. All these mean that diplomatic engagements center on managing cooperation rather than expanding cooperation. Managing competition rather than expanding cooperation. And countries are increasingly aligned around security and economic blocks, both by choice and by force. In Malaysia, at least among senior policymakers, I believe the thinking is that this growing fragmentation and bloc politics, will be very detrimental for small and middle powers, but it conversely also gives rise to the prospect of growing activism by middle powers and the wider global South who wish to preserve the collaborative nature of the international system, to preserve the rules-based order of the international system, to uphold norms that protected us, but also to create more equitable ones where necessary. And this is a space where we find a lot of common ground with India and the thinking in India. India has been an important leader in this space, and I think both Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Anwar find much common ground. Their messages on these largely align in the international system. Malaysia is also a supporter of UN reform, and Malaysia has been on records, including at the UNSC, and Malaysia has been on record supporting India's permanent membership there. One more issue that I want to touch on is relations with China and Pakistan. Malaysia-India relations doesn't operate in a vacuum. And I think while this won't define the bilateral relationship, it will always be at the back of minds for policymakers from both countries. Anecdotally, in my conversations with some Indian analysts, Malaysia's close ties to both of India's neighbors does come up I believe that if you were to track back, if you were to look at some social media posting by at least one of the MPs from the all-party parliamentary group that visited Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Indonesia following the India-Pakistan conflict in May last year, there was an indication that it was only in Malaysia where they found a premium was also placed on bilateral relations with Pakistan. So I can't speak for India, but for Malaysia at least, I think in the foreign policy establishment, trying to maintain a balance between the three countries, India, China, Pakistan, is a long-standing and inevitable part of our diplomatic calculus, given the importance that's placed on all three countries and given the complex relationship between the three countries. So it's an issue, but I don't think it will be the defining issue, but certainly a present issue. Uh, in Prime Minister Modi's visit, quite a number of his statements referred increased security cooperation, including maritime cooperation. I'd just like to touch on this slightly. What I think we are seeing now is a more structured approach to security cooperation, but led at the senior officials level. Uh, we now have something called a security dialogue between Malaysia and India. This is done at the level of the NSA for India and the Director General of the National Security Council for Malaysia. I think the first meeting happened early last year, which was actually an outcome of PM Anwar's visit to Delhi in August 24. I understand one more is scheduled in a couple of months' time for this year. Uh, the Malaysia-India Defence Committee, has met 13 times annually, but has met 13 for over 13 years, I think. But it's only since 2023 we have seen more progress in terms of focus of discussion and outputs. I think precisely because the respective defense ministers are now much more invested in driving the agenda. So you get things like the strategic working group that I mentioned earlier. You get things like the Sukhoi 30 Forum. Uh, India's statements over the past years when it comes to engaging with Malaysia has repeatedly highlighted maritime security cooperation as an important element it wants to pursue with Malaysia. We heard that again, we heard that from the defense and foreign Indian defense and foreign ministers when they visited Malaysia in 23, in 24 and 25. We heard that from PM Modi earlier in the month. However, I do not see any drastic escalation on this front, not yet anyway. I think you saw statements from leaders mentioning Navy to Navy interactions. You saw statements that talked up the continuation of exercises like Samudra Laksmana, Milan, ASEAN India maritime exercises. I don't think there's anything really new here. I think that Malaysia will be a bit cautious on the prospects of maritime security calculation, especially maritime security cooperation, especially in the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. Straits of Malacca for historical reasons. I think the Malaysian security establishment has always had a concern about India's ability to influence traffic in the straits with its significant naval presence in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. On the South China Sea, I think Malaysia is quite wary in drawing in third parties or to be seen as engaging third parties to balance against China. So I don't think we will see the scale of overt and covert engagements that India does with Vietnam or Philippines on this front in the South China Sea. It doesn't mean that there won't be a movement. I just think Malaysia will be deliberately cautious and slow about what it wants to do. Now, to conclude, perhaps I'll just touch a little bit on progress in the CSP and some pragmatic measures as I see it before I wrap it up. Uh, so a lot of the press statements before PM Modi's visit and during the visit and after the visit, a lot of them talked about this bilateral trade that has gone up between Malaysia and India. I think in 2025, it was about just a touch under US 20 billion. With Malaysian exports having an advantage over imports from India. In terms of scale in Southeast Asia, it puts Malaysia a distant third behind Singapore and Indonesia, which are India's largest trade partners in the region. It is a really far cry from from India-Singapore trade. And it's also a rather abysmal figure compared to the trading figures that Malaysia has with its top 5 or 6 trading partners. So yes, there is growth, but there's also a limitation here, and you get officials talking a lot about how trade underpins the relationship, but there is a gap between this trade and Malaysia's largest trading partners and India's largest trading partners in Southeast Asia. But beyond that, I probably won't get into that too much because again, I'm not a trade expert, but I think beyond those figures, I think there are some pragmatic developments in the bilateral relationship that we need to keep in mind that shows some promise. You see Malaysia seeking greater access to air access to Indian cities. Mars is already one of the best connected Southeast Asian airlines to India, and the routes, especially to sort of smaller second-tier cities like Kochi, Trivandrum, Amritsar, Ahmedabad. These are extremely profitable routes for Malaysia Airlines as they serve to connect Indian travelers with Southeast and East Asia as well as Australia and New Zealand. Indian tourists remain a major target for Malaysia. We had about 1.5 million who visited or passed through Malaysia last year. It contributed, to part of the record $32 billion that Malaysia is expected to earn from tourism last year. This year, it's Visit Malaysia year. It's a major tourism push by the government. And the official target for Indian tourists is slightly over 2 million, which is quite significant. And another announcement that came out at the visit, right? This decision to move ahead with linking India's UPI to Malaysia's Do It Now, which will make payments much more seamless for anyone with a mobile device, and it reduces barriers to trade and spending between both countries. I think these are really pragmatic measures that will have an impact on at least the movement of people and people-to-people relations for both countries. So from where I sit, to wrap up, I think one of the fundamental challenges of the Malaysia-India relationship, and the same really goes for the ASEAN-India relationship, is translating intent and vision into action. This is not new. This is very well documented. I would urge those of you who are interested to visit ISIS Malaysia's website. There is a policy paper there produced by my colleagues, Dr. Yanita and Jaideep, on making the CSP between both countries work. It came out in December 2024, a few months after Anwar's visit to Delhi. It's freely available, but I think the analysis and the recommendations made then are still relevant for today. So, almost a year on. So, political leadership is important, and we've seen that from both leaders. Prime Minister Anwar's visit sort of jump-started ties after a long hiatus. And Prime Minister Modi's trip earlier this month was this much-needed follow-up to push for deliverables and shape future ones. But political leadership needs to be translated into structured institutional arrangements between ministries, between agencies, between private sector stakeholders. So we have top-level push, but as always, we need to see whether this is reflected further down the chain. Sandeep, to conclude, I will go back to the title and the theses that you set, the promise and reality of bilateral relations, and whether we have yet to achieve the full promise, or is there a hard ceiling in place? I think that promise and in reality are interlinked, right? The reality of the bilateral relations also shapes the promise, but the promise of what could be provides the impetus of creating conditions to make it a reality. Given the size and scopes of our economies, this is especially applicable to India, perhaps more than Malaysia. Given the level of trade between us, the limited avenues of strategic cooperation that officials are trying to grow, I think there is a lot of promise to be achieved yet in that relationship. And while there will always be differing priorities and levels of readiness, which affects the areas of cooperation differently, I don't know whether I acknowledge that, but I don't know whether I want to call it a hard ceiling. Nor do I think is applying a hard ceiling particularly helpful here. I think neither side will, commit to anything that it feels will negatively impact its national interests. That's common sense and understanding. But understanding what these are and the factors that influence them domestically, I think will be very important for both stakeholders in India and in Malaysia, and it will help both stakeholders optimize the relationship. So, a relatively slow and steady pace of growth and collaboration means that there's certainly much promise in the relationship that could be realized if conditions allow, but it doesn't mean that there is a hard ceiling for that relationship. I think one thing for sure is that for both Malaysia and India, I think we both know that we cannot afford to ignore each other or cannot keep ties static. The facts of geography, of growth, of shared interests means that we're just too important to each other to set those hard limits. So I will end my remarks there and go for a much needed glass of water. Thank you, Sandeep.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. It is not only very interesting and insightful, but also very structured, very impressive, given that you did it without PowerPoint. I mean, I imagine I can't imagine doing something like this in such a structured manner for half an hour without a PowerPoint.
I will quote Mr. Yusuf Wanandi from CSIS Indonesia, who once said that when you have a PowerPoint, you will likely neither have power nor points. So just power through.
Yeah. But audience, please enter your question in the Q&A section, or you can message me. And but in the meantime, I have ended up with a lot of questions. So what I'll do is I'll keep asking them, and I'll keep including the audience questions in between while we are talking. Some of them sometimes message me directly, some come in the Q&A section, but we will have the conversation going for the next 45 minutes.
Sure.
So, first of all, just a tiny thing about Prime Minister Modi's visit this time, because it is interesting about the timing. You already mentioned that he skipped the ASEAN summit, which was noticed last year, and it was a big Malaysian big foreign policy push to bring all the big leaders together under one roof at the time. And it was reported widely that the decision was made because Prime Minister Modi was avoiding Trump. And invariably, the visit that happened just now happened immediately after India-US trade deal was finalized, which had been hanging for the last 6 months. So because of the timing, it kind of, so I was curious, how was the whole absence, and after that, this visit and the whole story of how India dealt with Trump, how was it read? How was it received in KL?
My personal view, to address the latter part of the question, there were some questions from the media. I think my colleagues had to deal with them in particular, whether the visit to Malaysia, immediately after signing the trade agreement with the US. Was it tied to the trade agreement with the US and India's push to diversify away from the US and to engage partners like Malaysia? And I have to agree with my colleague's assessment here. No, India and Malaysia would engage regardless, right? The US is not the driving factor of this. I won't go so much as far as to say that third countries and external issues don't matter. They do in reality, but they don't drive it. They're not the major foundation of it. I think, I would not know. I don't want to answer the question. I wouldn't want to hesitate. I guess put an answer on the question of what would Malaysians think of the trade agreement between India and the US. I think I've seen arguments, some arguments domestically arguing that that Indians held their ground for longer, potentially could secure a better deal. But then again, I've also seen converse, the other side. I think it's important to note to your audiences that the Malaysian-US trade deal is also very controversial domestically, and so any attempt to analyze sometimes attempts to analyze what other countries have done are often lost in domestic posturing and positioning of whether one believes the deal was good or whether one believes the deal was not good, but the best one could get, or whether one believes whether Malaysia should have done a deal at all. I think to go to the earlier part of your question, I think Modi's, Prime Minister Modi not being here during the ASEAN summit was very much noticed. There was a range of speculation as to why that may be. Most people that I've spoken to don't really put much stock in the official reason of being him needing to put in extra efforts for domestic elections, etc. I think there was a sense that given the state of the US-India relations at that time, Prime Minister Modi did not want to be in the same room as as President Trump. Given the unpredictability of President Trump, who knows what would have happened? Um, him coming here immediately after the summit was particularly important. It was good. I think conversations for this already happened quite some time ago. So regardless of whether a trade deal with the US was signed or not, it didn't really matter. I think the message that was put forward was that Prime Minister Modi will not be able to attend the ASEAN summit. However, given that there's been an invitation to reciprocate the visit Diaman Wame, he will prioritize a visit to Malaysia as soon as he can, and which is what he did, his first foreign visit of the year. I would also argue it probably does more for Malaysia-India relationship to have Prime Minister Modi to come here specifically for the bilateral rather than to be part of the broader ASEAN summit.
Yeah, you're right. I think that that ASEAN summit is very useful, but many times it also ends up as double counting, where where China, India, the US, they go to the country and they count it as a bilateral visit as well, but it's just about the ASEAN summit, doesn't really achieve anything bilaterally. So you're right about
Yeah,
that.
I mean, the ASEAN summit is, if you are not from Southeast Asia, the ASEAN summit is an excellent way to knock out about 10 to 12 bilaterals in one go. So it depends on how you look at it.
Yeah. Let me just add one question by my colleague, Dr. Ivan.
Mm,
I'll just read it out. Thank you for the talk. In the past, including in 2025, the Kashmir issue was an irritant in Malaysia-India relations. Relations have clearly recovered in the last month. In view of public sensitivities in Malaysia, how likely do you think is the Kashmir issue to re-emerge as the point of contention between two sides? And I want to add a couple of points here. One, if you could also, for those in the audience who don't remember or aren't aware of the previous TIFF that happened late 2010s, if you could
mm,
give a little bit of that background, and also if you could disentangle a little bit about the Kashmir issue in particular, and specifically India's repeal of Article 370 and removal of certain autonomy of formal autonomy of Kashmir in 2019, that decision and all the politics around it, versus this general sense that India's public image has taken hit, certainly, that the current government is a Hindu right government, the one which is not that friendly to Muslims in the country as and previous governments or something like that, right? Like the secular image of India has taken a hit. Those are two interrelated but kind of separate issues, and how those two operate within the Malaysian politics. If you could just speak about that as well.
sure. Okay, let me try, and feel free to intervene or to stop me if I'm going on too long, and force me to break it down again. I think Kashmir is a long-standing issue in Malaysian relations. I think Malaysian officials, the diplomats, officials, most, if you're a foreign minister or if you're a prime minister, you take this issue, you approach it cautiously. Because you don't want to upset relations with both India or Pakistan, and the space to do that is all, sometimes it gets a bit narrower than others. So I think Malaysia has always, I think, attempted to walk this tightrope between the two in a way that seeks to position Kashmir as a matter for India and Pakistan to resolve, but a matter that should still also, I think, be resolved in accordance with previous UN resolutions on Kashmir, which I think some Malaysian officials feel that neither India and Pakistan are actually adherent to. But of course, they won't say this out loud in the open. These are more private discussions. So I think Prime Minister Anwar to go back, will it be part of public sensitivities? Yes, because there are advocates of the Kashmir issue, especially from advocates of the Kashmir issue from points of position that clearly New Delhi won't agree with in Malaysia. And these are elements that are intertwined with domestic politics that the ruling government of the day will have to manage. So a prime minister or a foreign minister will have to balance this official diplomatic engagement and language with the realities of domestic politics and walk that difficult tightrope. Um, I think uh, um, Prime Minister Anwar has tried very carefully, I think, to navigate this in terms of the language that he used uh, to describe it, both in India and the language that he used to describe it when he went to Pakistan in 2025. So after his visit to India in 24, I think he talked about Pakistan in 25, sometime in 25. I just can't remember when for now. I think the language that he used in both countries were very carefully calibrated uh, to not put Malaysia in a difficult position, but yet to, in a way, give each of the hosts some face. At least that's the way I would describe it. Um, it will continue being an issue, and it's something that Malaysia will have to continue to manage. Now, you mentioned tensions in 2019. I believe that was when Kashmir status was changed. It also coincided with the citizenship. I could be wrong with the timelines, but the status of Kashmir was changed. I think we had a different prime minister then, Prime Minister Mahathir, who was in his second stint as prime minister. It was also not long after we had the first democratic change of government in Malaysia because of elections. Um, I think Prime Minister Mahathir has always been a very outspoken character on issues that he sees fit, and he has been a long advocate of Muslim causes around the world. So that particular narrative of Kashmir would certainly appeal to him. And he is not too bothered about diplomatic niceties or what other people think. However, uh, what I was told was that the particular bone of contention by some in New Delhi then was that some of his criticisms and talking, I mean, it was not just criticisms that was coming from Mahathir and statements that were coming, it was that some of the language mirrored very closely the language that was used by the then Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, who had a very close relationship with Mahathir. I think that particularly vexed some in New Delhi, which led to a de facto embargo on the purchase of Malaysian palm oil. Now that was there for about a year. It came to an end sometime in 2020. We had a change of government again, not through elections in March 2020, and soon after, in a few months, I think that government made it a priority to resolve the issue with India, and palm oil trade resumed. Um, I've probably been going on for a bit. If there's anything that you feel that I've missed, please let me know. I also see another question by Ivan, which I would like to answer on Malaysia purchasing BrahMos missiles from India.
So the another question from Ivan is there have been persistent claims that Malaysia considers purchasing BrahMos missiles from India. How likely is this development, and what is the strategic calculus behind taking or not taking such action? Although I
Okay,
would point out that there is no Southeast Asian country that there hasn't been discussion about in Indian media that they are looking to buy, and this has been going on since 2009 for most countries. So
absolutely, absolutely. I think the Indian media gets very excited at potential defense purchases. And the BrahMos missiles has had some success in Southeast Asia. I think Vietnam and Philippines have it. There's also persistent talks about Indonesia buying it. The second part of this question, right? What is the strategic calculus behind taking or not taking such a decision? Look, decisions to buy weapons in Malaysia are not made by men in uniform. They feed into the decision, but fundamentally, it's a political decision. It's made by the PM, it's made by cabinet, and the Ministry of Finance has a huge say in this because they're the ones who pay, they're the ones who will approve the funds. So what the men in uniform want is not necessarily what they'll get. There's a long history of this in Malaysia, and it explains, this hodgepodge of equipment and technologies that we have. I think in Malaysia, there has always been within the decision maker class, uh, a thinking that Malaysia buys weapons for defense, right? The primary aim here is defense, and therefore Malaysia should not invest in offensive weaponry that will seem as a threat to our neighbors or to other parties. And the BrahMos is considered as something offensive, and there has always been this barrier that we put for ourselves. I think it's doesn't make sense to me, but that is the thinking of those who call the shots. Um, on whether Malaysia will consider purchasing the BrahMos or not, uh, it has been discussed, but whether there's actually any progress on that, I don't know. It depends on the variety. Is it going to be mounted under the Sukhois? If it does, then the undercarriage and the framing needs to be strengthened because the BrahMos is not a light weapon. Are we going to do something like what the Philippines is doing and consider sort of land-based launchers, etc.? Um, uh, I would not, I would just urge a bit of caution on this. I don't see it happening. I think, as I said earlier, as you also intimated, um, I think Indian media tends to get a bit excited at what Malaysia may or may not buy just because a product is showcased in Malaysia or a product is being evaluated or a product or is mentioned by a foreign or defense minister doesn't mean that it's a lock-in. There are many considerations to go with it. If there was ever a chance of an Indian major defense purchase from India, it would have been the Tejas. But those who are much more aware of considerations for procurement weren't really placing their bets on it simply because at that point of time there was a feeling among Malaysian defense planners that the Tejas also had trouble satisfying their own domestic clients, the Indian Air Force, and there might have been political considerations to buy it, but I think some of the technical arguments won up in that case.
So very interesting. But you also mentioned something that I had no idea about the Sukhoi Forum. And
Yes, that's new. I don't know much details myself, but that is one of the recent outcomes of the strategic working group that came up.
Perhaps that's the thing because most of the discussion, I know that India has had a very serious push to build out its defense exports industry, and a lot of focus goes in trying to sell these big platforms. But I think that, and there has been very limited success on that front. But thinking about these issues, these ideas of something like maintenance or providing other kinds of support, that perhaps is a more lucrative and much more realistic goal for Indian defense export industry at this point, or perhaps something that is usually
Yeah,
more reserved.
it's an option that you can do with the Sukhois because you operate a huge fleet of Sukhoi 30s, and the domestic MRO capability in India on the Sukhois are probably the most advanced anywhere outside of Russia.
Right. So, since we are on the defense issue, let me just bring up the maritime aspect as well. The couple of things. One is India has expressed considerable interest and recently a renewed push to join the Malacca Straits Patrol. Do you think Malaysia would have an opinion on that, and what kind of opinion that would be?
Yes,
And
Malaysia's opinion on that is that thank you, but no thanks. The Malacca Strait Patrol was, one of the reasons why there was a Malacca Strait Patrol was that Malaysia and Indonesia were especially fearful that lack of security in the Malacca Straits would get other countries involved, right? So we better buck up. I don't think there was any issue about Thailand joining. But I think that Malaysia probably would have some reservations about India or any other external party joining. Because you have seen these interests being expressed time to time, not just by India. China does it as well, the US does it as well. So
yeah, so the other about the maritime aspect is also the what you mentioned very interestingly about the Andaman Nicobar and India's presence. India has Andaman Nicobar, but from Andaman Nicobar in some ways raising threat perception in Malaysia. This is historically in Southeast Asia in 80s and in 90s was a huge thing, a huge issue generally for many Southeast Asian countries about discomfort with India's naval buildup in Andaman Nicobar. But I was given to understand that to a certain degree has kind of faded as a concern. But it was interesting the way you framed it. If you could just unpack, one, how does Malaysia view that particular Indian naval presence in that area, and also has it changed in the last 20 years or last
Sure.
30 years?
I will give you my personal interpretation. I mean, my personal understanding of it based on conversations with assorted stakeholders. You're right. It is a historical point of view. And I think that some of these fears are residual. So they won't be as entrenched as they were before. It certainly is residual. I think on the part of India and on the part of Thailand and Indonesia especially, and also with Singapore and Malaysia, maybe more so Indonesia, Singapore, and then Thailand, and then Malaysia. Efforts by senior defense officials, security officials, defense, increasing naval exchanges and exercises. These has helped, increase familiarity and alleviate some of those concerns. Would those concerns disappear completely? No, I don't think so. Just as how there will always be a residual concern among Malaysian strategic planners of external powers getting involved for security matters in the Malacca Strait Patrol. I don't think it will disappear completely. Uh, I think. Sorry, there was a second part to your question that I know I missed. Can you repeat that, please, Sandeep?
No, I just wanted to get a sense of how these concerns. Is it a case of basically from 90s, these concerns generally in a decline, or do you think that there has been a change or there's an upswing at some point? How over the last 30 years have they
Sure,
been?
sure. I think it's generally been on the decline. However, for folks whose job it is to think of the what ifs, the relation, the nature of the relationship between India and China factors in. What if, God forbid, a clash spirals out of control and becomes a small war, a much larger war? Would it then be, it would be a reasonable hypothetical that India may wish to close off to block Chinese shipping from the Strait of Malacca. You don't have to come in, you can just do it from up north, right? And would it then not be a reasonable assumption that some Chinese strategic planner would be thinking of the same, which means that you would want to secure the Straits of Malacca or other waterways in Southeast Asia. And this thinking does not just apply to an India-China dynamic, right? It applies to broader concerns over Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait contingency and a broader conflict between the US and China. Malaysia is a country that is blessed by geography. We are strategically located in this major waterway. A lot of the development in the west coast of the peninsula is based on trade that is maritime connected, but it also provides challenges, especially when immediately that are not immediate to our region, but the ripple effects will affect us.
Since China also showed up and we are on the maritime topic, I just wanted to, if you could speak to us about, Malaysia's approach to South China Sea issue, and
Sure.
how does India fit into that? I know India is a secondary character in that. I mean, there are other bigger players in the game, but Philippines has a different approach to South China Sea and thinks about India in a different way. Vietnam has had its own very different, very distinct approach about it. So, what's Malaysia's larger strategy, and how does India fit into that? Or
Okay.
does it at all?
And sure. And I think Vietnam is an interesting case because Vietnam has had a much longer history of maritime security collaboration with India than almost anyone else in Southeast Asia, I think. Uh, now, I think, okay, so that's a two-part question. I think, the South China Sea dispute is one that is extremely important to Malaysia. It is one that is managed very delicately. By all means, there are differing schools of thoughts and differing threat perceptions in Malaysia among different agencies and different entities. But for the most part, the tone is set by the leadership. And I don't think you will, and from time to time, you will see differences of opinions emerge. But generally, I don't think you will see this happening too much now. Malaysia has very little ability to enforce its claims or to protect its claims or to patrol its claims. We have maritime challenges that go beyond the South China Sea, in the Andaman Sea, in the Sulu Sea in the east, the Straits of Malacca, IUU fishing on the South China Sea part that is closer to the east coast of the Malay Peninsula. Uh, all these are issues that we have to deal with, not just the contested features in the South China Sea. Um, it's also this contested area is also important to our hydrocarbon revenues. So Malaysia has to manage this very carefully. I think Malaysia's approach here, aside from relying on international law and norms, and aside from relying on closed door negotiations with not just with China but with other co-claimant states as well, is that I think given the challenges faced by Malaysia, the lack of capacity, the narrowing strategic wiggle room, I think Malaysia's approach is to, how do I put this? It is to not take any action that would give China an excuse to escalate, because China can control escalation. China controls escalation dominance, and we don't. Uh, I think this is one of the factors that guides Malaysia's response. I don't think you will see any official say this openly, but this is my sense. That said, Malaysia also has a history of cooperating with foreign parties in the South China Sea. Again, things that probably no one will acknowledge openly. We do this with some of our five power defense agreement partners. We also do it with other countries, and sometimes this irritates the Chinese. It often does, but Malaysia has been, but the cooperation with external partners. One way we justify it is that these are generally not new. They're elements that have been continuing since the 80s and the 70s. So it's quite easy for us to point to that historical precedence and to do it. To get in a new partner, especially so overtly, is a bit more tricky. I think you'll find a lot more folks here a bit more cautious in doing that, right? So it's not just India. You also have expressions of interest by the Japanese, by the Europeans, etc. And I think that's why you will find Malaysia being a little bit more cautious about that, because we can't sort of conveniently point to a historical precedent to say that we're actually not doing anything we haven't done for the last 20, 30 years. Uh, you know,
Five power, sorry, I'm just forgetting. It's UK, Australia, New Zealand, and US, right?
no, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia.
Singapore, Malaysia. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But so there's no, but there's not major US Malaysia partnership on that in South China.
A lot of things happen without any official framing. And this is sometimes what annoys Beijing.
But there's one thing that you mentioned, which was very interesting, about the Hindu temple dynamics. This is something that I didn't know anything about. If you could just elaborate on what that issue is, in Malaysia.
Sure. I mean, please don't take my word as gospel on this. It's extremely complex, and I need to read up myself. But I think there is an issue of a number of Hindu temples in Malaysia, very small temples, community-based, community-built, that were built, pre-independence or in the early days of independence Malaya and so on. And these were just built in land that was available close to small communities of Hindu worshippers, of Hindus. Now, whether these temples adhere to land codes and ownership codes, provisions where houses of worship could be built, etc. These were not concerns to the people who built the temples and who operated and worshipped in them for years and years and years. It is increasingly becoming an issue now in some cases because land has been bought up by private developers who want to develop land. In some cases, land are owned by private developers who don't want these Hindu temples there. In some cases, there are amicable negotiations and temples are relocated or there's government aid to buy land to relocate, etc. But in some cases, they are not, and because it involves ethnic and religious politics, it takes on sort of rather heated sentiments. It becomes emotional. especially since Malaysian Indians and Malaysian Hindus are probably on the lower end scale of those having political influence. So you have to tolerate a lot more pressure than you would feel comfortable with. Now, I think some of these issues have been weaponized by right-wing groups, have been weaponized by groups connected to who would like to, have a political vendetta to settle with the current ruling coalition, etc. Because the moment Prime Minister Modi left, a few days after that, this issue died down again. So you see it come up periodically when someone wants to stir an issue, and it gets a lot of traction, and then it dies down as quickly as it starts. At least this is my personal reflection on that.
Interesting, but the primary trigger for this is a development, like land developers, private land developers. It's more economic
It
than.
can be mixed. It can be mixed, right? It can be development. It can be mixed. In some cases, there are anecdotal arguments made that some private landowners want Hindu temples out of their land because they don't want Hindu temples on their land, etc. So
Uh,
you will find online, I think, you will find groups trying to categorize temples as illegal temples, for example, right? So these temples are illegal, so they shouldn't even be allowed to operate because they're on someone else's land, and there's no permit and so on and so forth. So these, it's part of the very complex, messy identity politics that we have in Malaysia.
Yeah, but it is interesting because the reason why I asked what is the primary trigger or the first trigger of this is because, yeah, I'm sure you must know that in India also similar politics plays out in reverse in terms of mosques. And
Absolutely,
historically,
absolutely.
a huge issue of this one particular mosque, Babri Masjid, I think
Mm,
that it was not
mm.
demolished in 90s. And that politics, I think, was less about private land developers. It was more of a political movement that had existed for a very long time, and a lot was built
Sure.
around that. And here it seems a slightly different dynamics playing out.
It's mixed, right? So I wouldn't want to say that I wouldn't want to say that it's only issue of development or an issue
Yeah.
of private landowners exercising their right to the land. I think you do find right-wing majoritarian narratives seeping into this very, very strongly. Even if the issue is it's a private dispute between the temple committee and the land developer, you will find groups trying to hijack it and to inflate things.
There's the one big question actually that I wanted to ask you from the beginning, but the talk was so interesting that it triggered so many other questions that particular question I kind of got buried. So, but the big question I wanted to ask you was that, the first time I met you, the first thing you said was that um, Malaysia is a trading nation and foreign policy is determined by basically that, right? Like that comes first. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts. I mean, I know you think more on strategic terms, but in terms of the economic aspect of this relationship, not in particular about trade flows and all, but which you already touched on in your talk, but how generally Malaysia views the economics with India. And let me break it down into two, three things. One is that what do you think is the most important, if you had to prioritize what are the economic goals that Malaysia has towards India, is it that Indian market, Malaysia wants greater access to Indian market? Is that the most important thing? Or it wants more trade, more investment from India? Or it wants technology from India? What is the primary motivator here in terms of what you would like to do here, right? Because say, for example, Thailand thinks that market, that's the most important aspect of it. But Singapore would have different thinking about it. It would be more about investments and stuff like that. So different countries, different economics, things like that. The other aspect of the same question is that does Malaysia think how much is it a complementary economy and how much of it is a competitive economy? Right? Because in some ways, they are, I mean, there is a lot of complementarity, but also in some ways, the economic models of what you're trying to achieve is very similar, right? Say, for example, semiconductors, right? Everybody wants a piece of that supply chain. And it's not always cooperative. In some ways, you have to see of these other countries as competition. So how much of that is viewed as a complementarity and how much is competitive? And that is the third part of it, which kind of has always puzzled me a little bit, that India has not signed a bilateral trade agreement with any Southeast Asian country other than Singapore and Malaysia. And with Singapore, there is much greater perceived complementarity because Singapore has a completely different economics, is a much more advanced economy, which is going after a very different value chain and has very different interests. And so it's natural to have some sort of trade agreement there. But Malaysia has this Sika, which has overcome a lot of these challenges that why India has not signed trade agreements with other countries like Thailand and others that it has talked to, or Indonesia, because it always felt that there was too much competition there or too much overlap there. How has that been overcome? So I think there were too many questions wrapped together in one. Sorry about
Sure, sure,
yeah.
sure. Too many questions. It's a lot of questions. I don't know whether I can answer any of them, but I will try. Let me perhaps try to take it from the top, right? I think, what Malaysia wants economically from India has actually evolved over the years. There was a point where Malaysia looked at India as an avenue for Malaysian companies, construction companies in particular, to expand and to gain new markets in. But that story is largely over because Indian construction companies are now rightfully performing in their own right, and the market is much more competitive for Malaysian companies right now. I think right now what matters to Malaysia, the Indian market has always mattered to Malaysia. You're a huge market. We just have about under 40 million people. You guys are over a billion. It's a huge market. But then what we sell to that market, right? India still remains the largest, if not one of the largest purchasers of Malaysian palm oil products. And you will continue to require edible oils in huge numbers. And I think this is a key focus for Malaysia, getting these oils to India, especially getting uh, sustainable palm oil products to India, because that's what Malaysia uses to differentiate itself from Indonesian palm oil. That our palm oils are much more in larger quantities are certified as more sustainably produced than our neighbor, which produces infinitely more palm oil than Malaysia anyway. Um, I think as India has developed as India has developed as a major global tech powerhouse, and coming up with the application of tech for different segments of the population. This is something that's extremely important to Malaysia, and we're going to look at what we can learn from India, and how Indian companies can set up and help us here to develop these tools for a much smaller segment of the market. I don't think there's going to be any competition with India on these things. It's a segment where Indians can come in and take advantage of, and your competitors will probably be from China in this field, or perhaps even Indonesia. Um, and tech. India has moved forward on tech in assorted areas, and again, this is it's an avenue that Malaysia is not competing with India on. So this is what we get. Of course, when it comes to market, another huge market for Malaysia is the Indian middle class, which now has a huge bug for travel. Uh, so you see, a deliberate political decision to keep extending visa-free entries visa on arrival, free visa on arrivals for Indian passport holders for up to 30 days. In a sense that because there is a sense that uh, more and more Indians are coming, not just for tourism reasons. Indian companies are increasingly holding retreats in Malaysia. There's an entire industry in Malaysia that caters for meetings, for travel meetings and conferences, workshops and retreats. And I was just told not too long ago that the customer base there used to be a customer base that mainly came from the West, and now Indians are making up a very important segment of these kinds of visitors to Malaysia. Um, I uh, I think how much is compatible and complementary, and I think this is really tied to the third question you asked of what makes the trade arrangement works. Um, I Again, as not a trade expert, I would not really classify us as being too competitive. There are elements of industry where India is we can't compete because you have scale and you have tech. But then there are also in Malaysia, in the semiconductor industry, for example, the investments that have come into Malaysia since the 1970s, has grown in scale. So Malaysia does not manufacture advanced semiconductors. We don't do that. We don't have the technology for that. It's too expensive to get into. We don't have enough water or electricity resources to do that. And even if we did, I doubt countries like South Korea or Netherlands or Germany would export these tools to Malaysia anyway. They're not even sending them to the US now. So everyone is keeping them at home. But Malaysia's strongest advantage in semiconductors is in testing fit and finish, and we can test fit and finish for extremely for advanced generation semiconductors. So this is how Malaysia tends to upscale, and I think this is a competitive advantage that we have over India. I think India wants to grow its rightfully so. It wants to develop its semiconductor industry. It's a huge market for it, but. But I think the thinking in Malaysia is that India probably will not be, it will not be competing for the kind of processes that Malaysia are looking at, because we are looking at moving on and upscaling. In the same way that Singapore has its own semiconductor industry, but it's extremely niche. They do stuff that is much more advanced than what Malaysia does. Uh, in fact, my understanding is that Malaysian semiconductor companies are actually looking at the possibility of investing in India because they want to move production from Malaysia to India so that we can move up the production scale. There is one of the barriers of Malaysia moving up the product. There are many barriers, but one of them is that we need to find places to offload existing work that we're doing, so that companies can invest in and push up the chain. Um, so I think again, from a very non-trade point of view, uh, I think the scale of the economies is just completely different, which probably allows uh, the trade agreements to work. Bear in mind, Thailand and Indonesia have huge domestic populations. The level of competition in terms of manufacturing, the products that you manufacture for, I would wager that there would be a greater degree of competition on that between India and Indonesia and India and Thailand compared to, let's say, India and Malaysia.
Um, Thanks. You say that you're not a trade expert and then you give such detailed answers. Let me ask you a final question
Sure.
about. So you talked about the triangular balance between Pakistan, India, and China, or not triangular balance, but the idea of maintaining some sort of balance between the Pakistan-India conflict and the China-India aspect of it. You, I think, very interestingly brought out how the Pakistan-India balancing is done and how that is thought about. On the China front, I'm curious if you could similarly speak to what, how does that balancing play out, given the fact that, of course, China is a much, much bigger and much more complex relationship for Malaysia on multiple fronts than India. How does that balancing play out? And connected to that, the bigger question, and I think this is exactly in your wheelhouse, you can't claim that you're not an expert in this one, which is about the Sino-US competition, right? I mean, in which, again, especially with, as I understand, the recent trade deal that Malaysia signed with the United States, it also has a clause that basically has this element
Yeah,
of,
the poison pill clause. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that, yeah. So given that particular rivalry is heating up, pushing countries to make choices one way or another, regardless of whether they want to or not. How does then within that India fit in, right? I mean, does India fit in at all in that front, or how is India viewed on that front in terms of what it can and cannot do, or how it can be an asset or a liability?
Sure. I'll answer the last question first and work my way back up. I think Malaysia's the relationship between Malaysia and China and Malaysia and the US has worked for the longest time. Our trade, investments that come from the US, the prosperity that we've had because of the relationship and the trade with India and with China and the US has really worked for Malaysia. Not just Malaysia, other countries, but in this case, Malaysia, because of the relatively functional relationship between Beijing and DC. That's changed, right? It probably took us a bit longer to realize this than we should, but that's changed in the long term. So this has presented real challenges to policymakers here. I mean, we are not alone in this, and I think you will see Malaysia, do what it has to do to try to maintain its edge, its interest with both Beijing and DC, but perhaps increasingly differently, right? So you see Malaysia signing the trade agreement with Washington, even though there are provisions in there that are probably not, that are not too helpful for us. You will see Malaysia continue to push for and to grow its trade and political relationship with China at the same time. It's possible to do both if you can show a little bit of guts and spine. Singapore does it all the time, so I don't see why they should be the only country in Southeast Asia who does that. It's possible to do both. But one of the biggest takeaways from this is that this growing conversation among officials, policymakers, political leaders is that it is high time for Malaysia to diversify away from just Beijing and DC, right? And we're talking about also diversifying away from the EU because they have their own dynamics with DC and Beijing, and from Japan. So we are looking. I mean, there are conversations about greater intra-ASEAN trade. I am a bit skeptical of that because Southeast Asians actually the biggest barriers that we have are among each other, not with not with external partners. But in Malaysia, you see this push for re-engaging the global South in a way that we have dropped for many years, and that's where India comes in, right? India is a huge mover in global South narratives in this emerging developing market, and it's a significant regional power of its own right. So that's where India fits in, right? In the context of the global South, but also in the context of India itself. So you will see Malaysia try to diversify. I mean, make no mistake, we're not going to, we will never willingly walk away from DC or walk away from Beijing, but there will be a move to diversify and to add on others and to see what we can do with others as well. And I think many people in the system here, many academics, some of my colleagues, in fact, have always said that it's high time for us to do that, and we've been too engrossed in looking at Beijing, Tokyo, DC, Brussels, etc. It's time for us to look, to look at the Middle East, to re-engage South Asia, not just India. But Bangladesh is a huge market as well in its own right, and once it gets its act together, so to go back to Africa and Central Asia and so on and so forth. On your first question, I think Malaysia has been relatively fortunate in the sense that while you have, there's always been tensions between India and China, it has rarely exploded out in the open as it did with India and Pakistan. So Malaysia's statements have always been very measured terms, right? Calling for peace, de-escalation, peaceful. I don't see this changing in particular. However, the reality is that China is a much bigger trading partner for Malaysia, which means that there will be, they will get that level of consideration. Whoever is Malaysian, and as many Malaysians found out last year, a lot of people did not really understand the scale of US investment and involvement in the Malaysian economy. Right up till the Americans decided to, right up till when the White House decided to flex it. And then people understood. And then you see the considerations being given.
Yeah, no, I mean, American power, I feel tends to be underestimated very often in this discourse, mostly by Americans themselves, nobody else. No, but I think but in terms of, yeah, but the India, China particularly, what I understand the idea that Southeast Asia has had for a long time now about strategic diversification and India being one of the actors to do that. But I worry about the, hardening of Sino-Indian rivalry, which last 5 years, especially after the Galwan Valley crash, has, I feel, kind of, even though there has been an effort to have this normalization effort in the last 1 year, the attitudes I feel have hardened a little too much, and there is a certain degree of zero-sum attitude there, and that then I think would have an impact on what Southeast Asia can also achieve through bringing India in or not bringing India in, because that maybe bringing a whole other vector of conflict into your backyard that you don't want.
Yes, which is something that we don't want, and I think this is an excellent subject for Southeast Asians to have discussions with both India and China together in the same room. Because I think for many Southeast Asians, I mean, this might be a less than realist view. I think it would be very disappointing if the relationship between India and China would spiral further. I don't think this is what most of us in Southeast Asia would want,
Yeah.
Especially given the wider conditions of the world and countries that previously preached about norms and rules are now turning them on their head by itself.
But thank you very much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I am really, really impressed by the systematic thought that you have in terms of how you answered questions and, took one part at a time and all that. It was very insightful. I have a bunch of notes that I'll have to take afterwards. And I'm sure this is the tragedy of having a webinar that you can't see people's faces. But I'm sure that our audience also got a lot out of it. Thank you so much, not only for this understanding this India-Malaysia relation, but the larger point as well. I think that it kind of reveals that on Indian perspective, sometimes there's this sense that all of Southeast Asia is the same, but every country in Southeast Asia has its own dynamics and own
Absolutely,
approaches.
absolutely,
And it kind
absolutely.
of gets outside Southeast Asia by many countries, it kind of, including New Delhi, kind of gets, obscured that understanding. It's very important to bring it out of, and that I think was one of the very useful things you did of teasing out how this is differing from what Singaporeans are thinking, or say Vietnamese are doing, or what Philippines is doing, or something like that. Yeah.
If I can have if I can have one last point, I think there is now a belated but still this growing understanding in Delhi, not just among NEA but among the think tank and the policy circle, that it is important to understand the nuances within Southeast Asia a little bit more, because you have an ASEAN position, which is the lowest common denominators, and then you have the position of ASEAN member states, which is what actually matters. So it's this understanding is starting to develop in Delhi, and hopefully, we'll see progress in that.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much. And thank you to
Thank you,
our
Sandeep.
audience. Hopefully, we'll see you next month with another edition of this. And hopefully, if everything goes well, it will be on India-Myanmar relations, especially India's role in the civil war there. So hope to see you again next month. And thank you once again, Thomas.
Thank you, Sandeep. Have a good evening and a good weekend. Bye-bye.